Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I've given a title for this afternoon's talk, the question, who am I? So, on the conventional level, I'm Ajahn Asoko. And as you can see, I'm a monk. I'm Caucasian. I'm not an English person. I was born in the US, grew up in Switzerland. And I can tell you a whole story. I've been around for 52 years. And usually when we think about this question, who am I, this is the kind of thing that comes to mind. And we all have our own stories and answers to that question. It's a very interesting question to ask ourselves and actually examine the answers that arise. The Buddha, he gives us this very useful toolbox, and one of the reflections that he offers us to try to answer this question and then try to examine the answers under various angles, deconstruct them and see what the answers are made of. Is what we call the 5 aggregates. The 5 khandhas is a Pali term. And it's actually very interesting to use that to examine the answers that arise. Sometimes as adults we get so accustomed to existential questions, we become a bit jaded and we dismiss them and get on with life. And we forget that probably all of us, when we were kids, we must have asked ourselves, who am I? And actually wondered. We maybe even asked our parents, school teachers, maybe a priest or a monk, grandmother. We asked them, who am I? Who are we really? And until I came to the monastery, I don't actually remember anyone in the world answering, I don't know. And then reading books or watching movies, these things come up sometimes, and it's interesting to see what people make of that. The answer usually gets dismissed. Children who ask what they are and get a result and a response, and then follow up on the question and say, well, if I'm this little boy or little girl, then what happens when we die? And then they get a complacent pat on the head and said, oh, don't you worry about that. That's a valid question. So the Buddha, he has this way of helping us to examine what we are. If we ask ourselves that question, then look at the answers that arise. Most of us here in this room will start by replying, we're human. Men or women, or Caucasian, Asian, from African descent, or Celtic, or mainland European, or whatever different answers are. We're young, we're old, we're healthy, or healthy enough, or maybe identify with having some disability. We see ourselves as someone who's generally happy, or maybe not so happy, whether unhappy or depressed, or someone who has PTSD. We have all these labels that we identify with. When we consider ourselves smart, well-educated, reasonable, intelligent, clever, quick, or maybe not so much. Like I'm not very good at that kind of intellectual stuff. And that's how we think of ourselves. More of an intuitive person. We have positive images of ourselves, or maybe we have not so positive, negative images of ourselves, perceptions that we formed somehow, that we were taught. We're told we're a good boy or a good girl, or a bad boy, a bad girl. So we carry all of that in us, these perceptions, these memories, these thoughts, views, opinions. And so when this question comes up, who am I? In terms of memory and thinking, this is what arises in the mind. When I ordained, came to the monastery about 21, 22 years ago, so I noticed that my thinking starts going along the lines of monastic conditioning. I was a junior monk, now I'm considered a senior monk, because I've been at it for over 20 years. And then I find myself thinking, sometimes I'm a good monk, sometimes I think I'm not such a good monk, and sometimes I'm just an okay monk, neither the best nor the worst. A good meditator or not such a good meditator. Sometimes I get invited to give a talk like today, followed by a question and answer session, or a retreat somewhere. And sometimes it just so happens, and I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, this is happening. And other times I find myself caught up thinking about it ahead of time. What am I going to say? Do I really have anything to tell people? And so we find ourselves with all these changing perceptions in our minds. They're not always the same, but we do find ourselves identifying with the perceptions that do arise. And that's where this toolbox the Buddha gives us, with these various kinds of reflections, come in helpful and help us to examine what's happening, what arises when we throw that question into consciousness. Who am I? And what arises? So Paul Sumedo is very good at pointing to how we identify with this body and throwing the question back, am I really this body? Are we really these bodies sitting here in this room today? We identify with them. My body. Right now it's probably comfortable, but we've only been sitting for 10, 15 minutes. So right now, this image we have of me, this body sitting here is one way, but wait another 20 minutes and we all start kind of shifting and moving. And our experience of this body is changing. So which body is it that we are? The comfortable one or the restless one? So these questions, investigating the answers, examining the answers, these are the things that we're able to do if we kind of are interested in pursuing the question, pursuing the answer. It's interesting reading the Buddha's teachings, hearing these teachings from various monks over the years, various teachers. We hear all kinds of things. Don't take whatever you hear just for granted or for being the truth. Most of what you hear is coming from people's own investigations and experience, and that's what they share. Doesn't mean it's what works for you. It's the answer that works for you. So the Buddha, he offers us this reflection where he points out that conditions, any conditions that arise, will cease, and challenges all of us to ask ourselves if what we identify with, if our answer to that question, who am I? You have an answer, you pin it to the board and say, that's who I am. You put a big black mark around it. Is that permanent? Or does it change? So that's one avenue of investigation. These bodies that we identify with, and we say, this is me, well, this is me now. And I promise you that 51 years ago I wasn't 2 meters tall. And I wasn't dressed in these brown robes. And yet when I was a kid, probably after the age of 6 or 7 years old, when we start having a sort of social awareness in relationship to members of our families, to going to school, other people in school, other kids, teachers, and start forming friendships and circles of acquaintances, people we like, we dislike. This is how we form this sense of who we are. So I have memories, we all have memories of what it felt like when we were younger, under 10, and then in our teens, in our 20s. Back then too, we identified with this body as being me, and yet it's not the same body anymore. It doesn't feel the same. So which one is it? And then there are all these people that we used to know who are also with us around here who've passed away. Parents, grandparents, friends, sometimes really people younger than us who've passed away. And sometimes we have the opportunity to witness what happens to these bodies, see what a body's like that doesn't have consciousness anymore. I was fortunate enough to work as a student in a care home for elderly people. And after a couple of years, I was able to work night shifts because it allowed me to be more adaptable with my studies schedule. And there's one of the things that fascinated me the most was at night, during the night shift, if someone passed away, we would prepare the body, clean up, and make it presentable for when the relatives would come the next day. And then the rest of the night is not all busy. And during one of the quiet times, I'd go into the room, leave the lights out, and there was enough street lights coming in through the windows, and I'd just sit in the room with this body. And there was something about the mystery that was really fascinating. Sometimes it was someone who had passed away peacefully. Other times there were people who were very, very anxious before they passed away. And in either way, in either circumstance, what we are left with is this body lying cold and stiff, completely quiet. So what happened? What changed? There's no one there to be anxious anymore, or to be at peace. It's just the body. And that's what's going to happen to this one. sitting right here. So in the context of this question, who am I? And this tendency, this habit to say, this is me here. Notice how we're pointing to this body. This body is not permanent. It changes from youth to middle age to old age. And then because it's born, one day it'll die. Well, then who am I once this body is dead? And notice what happens in the mind when you ask that. Are we comfortable with that, or are we uncomfortable with it? Is it okay not to know? Or does it make us feel nervous and anxious and need to find an answer? Either way, whatever way we react to that is fine. I'm not saying one reaction is better than the other, but what it does reveal is how much we may identify with this body as being. So that's the first of the 5 aggregates that the Buddha points to. The other 4 are feelings, pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, neutral feelings, which come and go all day long. And just right now, if you ask yourself, in terms of these feelings, which one is the dominant one right now? Does it feel pleasant sitting here? Maybe you say, yes, the chairs are really quite nice, actually. Or because that, whatever. Temperature is pleasant. We just had a meal, so the body feels comfortable. So we can say, yes, it's quite nice sitting here. Or maybe we have physical discomfort, and the answer to the question is like, not so comfortable right now, a bit tense, a bit achy. But very often when we ask ourselves that question, the answer is like, it's not pleasant and it's not unpleasant. So kind of neutral, somewhere in between. But this kind of feelings, whether it's how we feel physically, how we feel in terms of moods and emotions, this sense of feeling good or not feeling good, we identify with. In terms of conversation, sometimes when we're getting to know each other, people get to know each other, sometimes it is a question that comes up, like, do you consider yourself genuinely a happy person? In terms of conversation, it's a valid question. It's engaging, makes the person think, sometimes tell stories about themselves. And so we may find the answer is, yeah, generally, reasonably happy or quite happy. I'm an optimist. Or sometimes you may say, well, not sure. But then we can't always answer that question the same way. Maybe go again. Distraction. This building is alive. We don't always answer that question the same way. Like if we're having a rough day, if things are rough in life, difficult, the experiences that are coming our way are just really challenging and we're finding it difficult, and someone asks us that question, to consider yourself generally a happy person, sad, unhappy, or just kind of average, the answer is not always the same. And if we don't examine, if we're not interested in this question, who am I, and if we don't examine the answers, we might not notice that what we take for granted, being here as an entity of reality, is actually based on a body that's changing, on feelings that are changing, on memories that are changing. How I perceived myself at 12 years old was vastly different than I perceive myself now, because 40 years have gone by, a lot more memories. and crude. And so this perception of who I am according to memory, for all of us, changes as time goes by. So that's the third aggregate, the third group in the five khandhas, is memory, perception. And probably all of us have written down a curriculum vitae, a CD, present it to someone when we want to find some work. This is who I am. We probably leave out a lot of stuff. But it is part of who we consider ourselves to be. So here in the monastery, we have a community that's slowly aging. When Ajahn Asoko first established the community here, full of young whippersnappers, full of energy and quite young, just about everybody were probably in their 30s, and now, 50 years later, some have passed away, a number have left, and those who are still around are getting old. So we have someone like Ronpo Sonedo, who's 91 years old and has an extraordinarily good memory, who's very sharp. Just listened to one of his talks, and he's probably can put any one of us to shame in terms of sharpness and memory. But then we also have members of the community who are aging and who are losing their memories. So what happens to who am I when I have good memory and then when I lose my memory? Then what happens to that? Do I disappear? Do I cease to exist when I lose all my memories? And again, not to necessarily find an answer to that question, but just to realize that what we take for granted as me here, with my body and my feelings and memories and views and opinions, that's what we take for granted, but it's not that simple. These things that form the assumed answer, the automatic answer, keep changing. So the fourth category in the aggregates, the khandhas, are thoughts. What we call them mental formations. All these things that are fabricated in thoughts and views and opinions and moods, emotions, they're all created in this mental space and the mind and heart. And that we take for self. And sometimes we're happy with that package and sometimes we're not. And views and opinions are conditioned, they change. A few years ago, in the UK, England was part of Europe. So England people saw themselves as Europeans. That has changed. When I was a junior monk, I was very idealistic. Came to the monastery full of memories of having visited before and what kind of experiences I'd had and what I was going to make of my opportunity as a monk. Idealistic and perfectionist. And I went at it with a revenge. And then I quickly became disillusioned. Because operating from an idealistic point of view usually misses the reality that's right in front of our noses. We end up tripping over all kinds of imperfections of life which don't match the ideals. And we forget to look at what there is. Instead, I found myself obsessing the way I wanted things to be. So ideals are fine, not criticism of ideals, but I learned that holding ideals very tight doesn't usually lead to happiness. So views and opinions change from our experiences. And the fifth category in the khandhas, the aggregates, is called sense consciousness. And that refers to how we experience consciousness through the senses, the five: sight, sound, hearing, smelling, tasting, and the physical body that feels and touches. And one of the things the Buddha says about these five aggregates is they're all impermanent. So back to this question of his, he would ask the monks, but he would ask lay people as well when they visited him, ask about his teachings. Does it hold up to grasp something that's impermanent and expect it to be a basis for self? But it doesn't. Or if it does, then that sense of self is as impermanent and as that on which it is based. What's good about this reflection generally is the ability to ask the question and be stymied by these answers, to be, in a way, stopped in our tracks by what reality is actually telling us. The bodies are impermanent, feelings keep changing, memories and perceptions change. And some memories we lose altogether, we can't recall. Others we keep tweaking and enhancing along the way, and then we create a whole bunch of new memories. So those keep changing. Feelings that are pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral keep changing. Thoughts, views, opinions, moods, emotions keep changing. And the way we experience the world through our senses keeps changing. I can't read without glasses anymore. I used to have very, very good eyesight. When I was in medical school, I could step 3 meters backwards from the line from which you read the bottom little squiggles on the test board. And 3 meters further back, I could still see it clearly. Can't do that anymore. But I have friends who are blind. We don't have eyesight anymore, so senses, our physical senses change. For Bolsonaro's eyesight is going, his hearing is going, his physical sensation, his physical ability to sense the body has changed. He's got numbness in the feet, his balance isn't so good. So we can really witness within ourselves, these bodies here, and other people around us, we can witness how senses change. So as we ask ourselves this question, who am I? And we watch the answers that arise, this sense of I, the body, the feelings, and all this whole package keeps changing. So this self, this sense of self, the image we have of ourself, is something that's constantly changing. There's not a reality that we can grasp and pin down. So what of the question, who am I? Is it actually a valid question? Or how do we answer the question? Can we go past these five aggregates? And if so, what's beyond them? If we go past everything that's impermanent, what do we find? And at this point, the mind tends to go quiet. And it's very good to be able to stay with that, to allow the mind to be quiet, to allow the answer to who am I kind of stump us and go, well, I don't know. In many ways, it's a much more peaceful answer than any of the others. because all the other answers tend to be frustrating. Any one we try to pin down, we end up dismissing because it is impermanent and doesn't really hold water. And this is where the pointers that Von Tomato keeps offering us become so useful, where he keeps hammering away at consciousness and awareness, where the Buddha talks about mindfulness, about awareness. And our relationship to these five aggregates, everything that we experience that we can take as a self, that kind of fits in one of these five categories, or maybe in several of them. In terms of experiences, they all arise and cease. But the one thing that we can notice is they all arise and cease in awareness and in consciousness. The fifth category is very interesting, sense consciousness. Sometimes that's a question that people ask because initially they find it confusing, given that language is limited and we're trying to use this convention of language to describe something that really goes beyond language. What about consciousness that's sometimes described as pure, boundless? And then on the other hand, the Buddha says, well, in terms of the fifth aggregate, it's impermanent. So which is it? But it's good to notice that in that fifth aggregate, we sometimes say consciousness, but really it is sense consciousness. The way we relate to consciousness through the senses. So I'm looking at you, you're looking at me, or at the floor, or at the ceiling, but whatever we're looking at, we know we're seeing. And in that, there's the knowing and the seeing. We know that we hear sound. We kind of come in contact with consciousness through the experience of hearing. Because hearing arises in consciousness. Seeing is a conscious experience. Smelling, tasting, and touching, the sense of being here, sitting. So the investigation started with who am I, and we get to investigate these five categories, and what we find ourselves with are these experiences that are all impermanent. And it's not a question of taking my word for it, or taking Ajahn Sumedho's word for it, or the Buddha's word for it, which sometimes we can do when we look at things around us and we intellectually, as an intellectual exercise, say, yeah, that's impermanent, yes, this is it, kind of dismiss everything. But to actually come back to what we can know in terms of experience. Whatever we're experiencing now changes. Can we stay with the experience and witness it change? The temperature in the room keeps changing. Those kind of electronically controlled windows open and close, and I don't know what's happening with the ventilation. The system is supposed to keep us at a regular temperature with enough oxygen so we don't all get drowsy, and yet it's after the meal. Whether what I say is interesting, completely boring, some of us are awake and some of us are kind of feeling the head getting a bit heavy. These are changes in feelings in the body, of states of feeling restful, rested, awake, and clear, or feeling a bit drowsy and lethargic. So that's where what we call meditation becomes an exercise of investigation. And not investigating in the sense that we think about it all. We can definitely use thinking, but we're looking and exploring from this sense of knowing, exploring this sense of consciousness. We all experience our bodies, the senses, our minds, with the feelings and perceptions, memories, thoughts, emotions. We all experience these things. And in picking up this question, who am I, and seeing where it takes us in terms of exploration, it brings us to examining these experiences and knowing for ourselves whether they are impermanent or not, being a witness to their arising, to their changing, and then their ceasing. So we're looking at the question, who am I? You might actually assume that there is an I there who is. The question itself is based on the assumption that there is a me here. So given that there is a me, who am I? What am I? So the I that I tend to assume is the answer to that question, this body, these feelings, is basically one or several of these five aggregates that we just went through. They're all impermanent. So if the answer to who am I is one of those, then I am impermanent. And that's rather interesting. Next time I have someone asking me for a CV, oh, who are you? I have no idea. You figure that out. It's probably not a good way of doing the job. But it is interesting to kind of examine that and then realize how our assumption that there is a me, a permanent me that is a certain way, how that operates. One very good place to notice that is in social interactions. When you have a disagreement with someone, and usually when we disagree with someone, it's very frequent that our reaction is, I'm right, let me show you why. That implies you're wrong. And there's a very strong sense of identity there. And sometimes we have these kind of misunderstandings or arguments based on a confusion. Here in the monastery, we have people from different backgrounds who use English as a common language. Not everybody was born speaking English. So people come from all over the world. And mother tongues may be different, and we're all trying to use the same language, and we have misunderstandings. Even among native English speakers, there are misunderstandings, because what I say is not exactly what I mean, because this wretched language is imperfect. As literate and educated as I may be, we sometimes find language just not adequate to express or convey a meaning, a position, a feeling, a sense. But when we do have these misunderstandings, that's a very good place to notice how habituated we are to come to a position, to a view, to an opinion, and hold to it and identify with it. And if somebody doesn't agree with us, there's something threatening about that. So often we become defensive in an argument. And sometimes defensive is not enough, so a bit of aggression helps get the point through, and we can squash that one. And then we move on and we look back on it and we realize, actually, shoot, I was wrong, actually. And we just, if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes I find myself more often than not, I fortunately catch myself before getting into arguments more often than not these days. But in terms of feelings, the feelings are just such strong habits that I very often feel very grateful that I didn't get into an argument, because what it was based on, the position that I found myself grasping in spite of myself, that led me to take a position in an argument, I would have been properly embarrassed to actually argue, stake my sense of self on a position that a minute later or 5 minutes later I realized was completely mistaken, confused. Maybe I was the one who misunderstood something. And yet that's what we do. We stake a lot on these positions that we take and assume to be self. So it really is worth examining what it is that we consider home base, this me, this I that operates, and that we assume is a constant that goes through life, emerged from childhood at whatever age. And some people have pretty clear memories from the age of 3 onwards, others from the age of 9, 8, 9, but somewhere before 10 years old. Usually people already have a sense of who they are in the family constellation of being a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister, a single child, and being a child of loving, affirming parents, or maybe neglectful parents, or abusive parents, or combination, intelligent parents, confused. Whatever it is, we start creating a sense of me along the way, and then we just assume that this me goes all the way through, and one day the lights will go out and it's the end of the movie. But it's really worthwhile examining that and exploring what it is that we assume to be self. And when we really do explore it with sincerity and integrity, we can start realizing that most of the things that we do take for granted as self are actually changing. It's rather humbling. And we become more hesitant to kind of engage in life in general on these assumptions that keep changing. We feel less certain, more willing to say, I'm not sure, I don't know. And from that position of not knowing, we actually find ourselves more open. Well, that openness is important because that openness allows us to start looking at what is in front of us for what it is, rather than assuming it is a certain way and running with assumptions. And from that position, we start realizing, yes, experiences arise and cease. They change, they are impermanent. Not as an intellectual kind of label on things, but actually knowing that here, because we witness arising, we witness change, we witness cessation, and then after things have ceased, we can start noticing we are still here. Like in terms of language, I'm still here, but what is it that is still here? And exploring our relationship to experience, to conscious experience, we start taking a step back from the experiences, because we realize they're impermanent, they keep changing, they're not reliable. They are what they are, but we can't really put much money on them, we're going to lose. So we take a step back from experience, from phenomena, recognizing them a little bit more clearly for what they are. And as we take a step back from phenomena, we're taking a step closer to the other part of conscious experience, which is consciousness. And as we do that, there are a few things that we have to let go of. And one of them is language. Language is good at describing experiences. It's absolutely dreadful at describing consciousness. I challenge you to try. I mean, I've been in, because I am a more senior monk, and I find myself in this position to start sharing some of my experiences and insights and explorations of the Buddha's teachings. I get asked these questions, but you can ask yourself. Try to describe consciousness to yourself, not the experiences that arise in consciousness, but awareness itself. And words just don't do it. We can try, but then even the word consciousness or awareness is still just a word. It doesn't pin down consciousness itself. So there's one of the things that Rinpoche Meadows said very often in his teachings, and that he tends to repeat again and again, and more as he gets older and he's trying to distill the essence of his insights, is how nothing that we experience is consciousness. The body isn't consciousness. Our moods, our emotions, when we get angry, consciousness does not get angry. Anger is something that arises and ceases in consciousness, but consciousness knows anger. It can't possibly be anger. Or happiness. When we say, I'm happy, that's language. It's back to who am I? I'm a happy guy. Back to that assumption. And in terms of language, it's fine. It's how we communicate. But in terms of what we really are, I can't say I'm a happy person because happiness just won't last, even though I try to make it. It doesn't work like that. Or misery. Sometimes we feel absolutely wretched and miserable. And it feels very real. We said, someone asks us in the morning, so how are you doing today? We don't even want to answer the question. Leave me alone. And we're so convinced by this mood, by this feeling that's in the mind. And yet when people went up to Ajahn Chah and told him that they felt a certain way, in particular with anger, he would challenge them. He would say, and in Thailand, it's very interesting, the challenge he gave them. It's a tropical country, it's hot and humid, or both. And he would tell the monks, go back to your hut after the meal when you feel full and heavy, wrap yourself, close all the windows. These huts were made with tin roofs, so the sun is beating on the tin, making it really sweltering inside. Close the doors and windows so there's not much air moving. Put all your robes on and put a blanket on. And then when you're steaming hot like that, see how long you can stay angry. I challenge you to stay angry for the rest of the day. It's not possible. But we have to challenge these perceptions. We have to challenge these assumptions that we believe in order to test them and then reveal the fallacy of believing that is a me, that there is something permanent there. So as Rinpoche Meadow keeps pointing out, consciousness knows conditions, but consciousness is not a condition. One impermanent condition is not capable of being a reference for all other conditions. It's not possible. So that brings us to explore consciousness versus experiences versus conditions, or as we call them in Pali, sankharas. So this sense of identification is not something that we decided to do one day and we can just decide not to do today at 3 p.m. on a Sunday. I'm tired of this nonsense. I'm stopping it. We find that when we practice, when we examine how we work and how we operate, we realize this is really sticky business. There are habits in the mind, habits that we have to go through these perceptions of me being a human being, a man, a woman, a younger, middle-aged, older person. These perceptions of ourselves as being happy or unhappy, smart or a bit slow, or somewhere in the middle, educated or not. I'm part of the urban elite, or no, I'm a country guy. We have these identities. We operate from them. People vote from these identities. That's how we elect people to represent us, in democracy at least. So noticing what these are and being willing to challenge it and question ourselves, and using the Buddha's, this tool he gave us, this format of the 5 khandhas, the 5 aggregates, is very, very useful to help us take a step back from all these identities that we hold to usually and start examining them. He's not telling us to reject them, he's inviting us to examine them. But the natural result of examining them is realizing, yes, they are indeed impermanent. So now what? And then with Bosonena's reflections of coming back to consciousness and using, in terms of investigation, using these questions that we can ask ourselves intellectually, using thinking, and when we feel a certain way, am I this feeling? Can I really just invest a sense of self in me and feel completely secure in identifying with a certain feeling or not? And what happens when I do? And we usually find that we run into some kind of trouble. What happens if we say, yes, there is this feeling present, like maybe someone did something and we are pissing mad. But even in that state, we can ask ourselves, am I pissing mad? Am I about to turn into a murderer? Or is this a feeling? And feeling in a range is like this, but consciousness isn't in a range. Consciousness knows anger is like this. And when you explore things like this, you find there is a space between consciousness and sankharas, between awareness and the conditions that we are experiencing physically, mentally, emotionally. And the work of meditation, not just sitting meditation on a zafu in a chair during formal meditation practice, but the work of meditation, work of investigation, of exploration, spiritual searching, is something we can do with any experience that arises from dawn to dusk. We can at any given moment ask ourselves, starting with on the conceptual level, on the verbal level, using language to bring us back to here and now. How do I feel right now? Physically, mentally, whatever it is, and then explore that. Am I relating to this as a self, out of habit? Is this me? And usually you'll have a cue or two that we're doing that because we like it or we don't like it. We want or we don't want. It usually involves desire. So desire is one of the little red flags in the picture that gives away self. And then we can ask ourselves, well, using this other way of looking at it, in terms of consciousness, what is this? Well, this is a good feeling or an unpleasant feeling. It's this or that mood. It's physically feeling like this or like that. It's me being a certain way, and then we turn it around and we say, being this way in consciousness, is consciousness actually that? And you always inevitably come back to this position of being the witness of conditions, and the conditions change, because that's what they do. Doing this work allows us to become free from the conditions. Every time we grasp a condition, out of habit most of the time, not intentionally, we grasp something, identify with it, and then we react to it. We become completely entangled in conditions, and we can't see clearly because we're blinded by our reaction and our involvement in them. Whereas coming back to this position of the witness, consciousness, awareness, witnessing, that at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, digesting the meal is like this, it's different than it was an hour ago, 2 hours ago, and then 2 more hours and feel different again. So whether it feels good or a little bit unpleasant or heavy or whatever it is, may generate reactions, but consciousness isn't either the feeling or the reaction to the feeling. Every time we come back to consciousness, we find ourselves in a position of freedom from the condition. The condition's there, but we're not necessarily reacting to it. Our feelings of liking or disliking do not necessarily lead to wanting or not wanting. If they do, consciousness itself can witness wanting, desire arise, and we have the freedom not to get involved, to let it pass. And that position of freedom is one that allows us to see things for what they are clearly, without being blinded by the desires, by greed, by hatred, or by just being confused about what's happening. And so if something requires a response, it's coming from a place of freedom, rather than from a place of identification, attachment, and ignorance. So I'll stop here for now. I think I've said enough. There's some tea available somewhere. Are there any questions anyone would like to ask you? If people are willing to wait for the microphone to go around, because then everybody can hear the question, and I don't need to repeat it or translate it.
I'd like to just ask about, you suggest that consciousness is separate from what it's conscious about, which seems reasonable and the right approach, but the only thing isn't consciousness in itself dependent on us, in a sense, being alive and having a brain and all the senses, to get the things to be conscious about?
Well, that's a valid question, but it's a question that only each of us can answer for himself. Like, I can give you an answer, but you'll still either believe me or not believe me. And the Buddha's answer and the enlightened masters' reply to that is that, when they talk about the Dhamma being the unconditioned, the unborn, the unformed, what they're talking about is consciousness, that they sometimes describe as pure consciousness, consciousness being pure, without limits, without object, and radiant all around. And that's one of the Buddha mostly did not answer questions that were addressed to him about the nature or the characteristics of Nibbana. For several reasons. One is how do you describe something that's beyond all conditions? And then if you try to put some words to it, then people who don't know it are going to grasp the words rather than look for the genuine product. And so it's a little bit the same with your question. The question is a very good question, but it's something that this kind of question is something that we have to investigate and answer for ourselves. And it's part of what the practice presents to us. But that's the Buddha's teaching contains, like in the suttas at least, contains statements where he talks about consciousness being pure and consciousness being, as the pure consciousness being free from all features and any objects. So he's making that statement not for us to believe, to take as a dogma. He's just saying this is what he's discovered. And this whole Noble Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, this whole teaching is an invitation, an encouragement to follow in his footsteps. So he says he's reached the end of his search, and this is what he's found. And this is what led him to this point, this Noble Eightfold Path, this path of investigation and self-examination. And he gives us a lot of goalposts and markers to find along the way, but it's up to us to be motivated, interested, to care enough to follow, and also to have an element of trust. Do we trust the Buddha enough to be interested in his descriptions of the path and the goal? And does it encourage us to follow in his footsteps? But in his own teaching, and it was one of the things that he said on his deathbed to the monks who were around him, he said, "Do not believe in what I say just because I'm the Buddha, out of respect for me, out of love, out of veneration, out of faith, because it sounds logical and reasonable or any reason whatsoever. Examine this for yourself the way a goldsmith would put to all possible test a piece of ore that someone brings him and tells him this is gold. The goldsmith would take it on and put it to all kinds of tests until he knows for himself this is gold. And then you say, okay, I'll take it for so much. But no goldsmith worth his salt is just going to buy a lump of dirt on your word or mine. So the Buddha is encouraging us to really test it for ourselves and investigate for ourselves. What he says is, there is this consciousness that is pure, that has no feature, no limit, that is completely luminous all around. So the rest of us go, mm-hmm. Is that so? But then we have to find out for ourselves. But in exploring these things, it is really like one of the things that what we call meditation is the opportunity to just sit down and watch this. And we come to these teachings, we come to life, and then if we're fortunate, if you run into these teachings of the Buddha, and have the fortune to come to a monastery where we practice and hear the teachings, and sit down and go to the temple. There's several times a day, a whole bunch of people sitting quietly together doing what? And this is what we're doing. We're investigating, trying to find out for ourselves. And in the process of trying to find out for ourselves, we grope around in the dark. Because no matter how clear the Buddha's teachings are, when it comes to making use of them, and for them to lead to something that we can know for ourselves, we have to take these teachings, and in terms of thinking, they're fine. They might seem like, and they are a very neat and tidy package, even on from a logical point of view, from a rational point of view. And one of the things that always leaves me in awe of the Buddha's teachings when I reflect on them is how you can pick up one element in one corner of the teachings, and you find yourselves back with the whole package. You open up the whole package, delve into any which avenue of the teachings, and it's completely coherent and circular. It always brings you back to the same thing. So even on an intellectual level, on a conceptual level, it's incredibly pleasant thing to explore. But what it does, if we're not careful, if we just indulge in the intellectual venture, we go around in circles, and we end up being like someone who's buying cookbooks and reading them and finding all these fantastic recipes, but never taking anything to the kitchen and cooking up a meal. We stay hungry. And so the point is, okay, how do I use this in my experience? And then at a very basic level, just thinking about the teachings, because they're so pleasing, and then on a logical level, once you've read enough, you don't have to read the whole 2 meters of books on the shelves to understand the Buddha's teachings, but once you've read enough and you understand them enough intellectually to serve as a map, well, then you come to the actual landscape inside and start exploring and refer back to the map and says, oh, what does he say about this? But that's something that any of us can only do for himself. And I don't know if you've done Boy Scouts when you were a kid, or you've learned to do some sort of read maps and run around the country and look on the map and see where the roads are and where's north. You use your compass. You have to figure this out, and you're going to get it wrong. You're going to go down the wrong side of the field or the hill, the mountain. You're going to get lost. And that's part of the practice. Is getting all confused, turned around, and learning to how do we apply these teachings, these pointers, these encouragements that the Buddha gives us, how do we really apply them to this conscious experience so that we can understand it better. And so I was reading, there was one point a few years ago, I was really interested in articles in science that researched consciousness. I was wondering where they were at in terms of research. It was a very, very, very rare article where the researchers did not operate from the assumption that consciousness is in the brain. The majority of these research projects start the first step of their research is one step after this assumption. And fortunately, it was really nice to see that a few of them had a form of integrity in their quest, that they would realize they made this assumption and they cannot prove that assumption. And they're left with a research project that instead of giving them nice, tidy answers, and it's a research that they can reproduce, like scientists like to do, they end up going, well, rats, we don't know. And I really appreciated those because of the honesty that's behind it. So it doesn't give us one of those definitive answers that you can put in the conclusion of the article and print in a magazine, and you get kind of praise and accolades. Because in terms of when you look at your own experience, can you actually prove that consciousness is in the brain? There are good reasons why we make that assumption. Because out of the 5 senses, there are a lot that are based in this skull. The eyes, the ears, the smell, the taste, and part of the touch feeling of the body is around here. So there's a lot of where our conscious experience based on senses kind of seems to go around here. And then in the medical world, they've had these kind of evolutive steps about how to determine that someone's dead. And they went through the stages of the heart stopped beating, so the heart was the seat of life, to the brain, because they realized the heart can stop beating. But if the brain still functions and then somehow the heart starts beating again by itself or through medical help or whatever, as long as the brain hasn't suffered a certain amount of damage, then life continues. Okay, so the seat of life is there. And what we assume is the seat of life is consciousness. And we can talk like that and sound very knowledgeable and confident and authoritative. But I don't have that. I don't know what the heck I'm talking about. It's all assumptions. And so I was reading these articles and I bring them to L'Enfant every now and then, especially when I came across the ones who ended up with, well, actually, we don't know where the seat of consciousness is. We tend to assume it's in the brain, but we can't prove that. And if we can't prove that, then the assumption we cannot take for true and real. And they kind of end up scratching their heads, and I can like that, because every time we end up with I don't know as an answer, what you realize is we don't know on an information, rational thinking level. But in terms of consciousness, when you look at what state that leaves you in, it leaves you you're still conscious, whether you know something or you don't know something in terms of information. Consciousness is still here. But not knowing tends to leave us wide open, which is a very good place from which to look at things rather than assuming we know, which narrows the focus and then we miss out on it. And so I was talking about this with Paul, and he said this thing. He said, yes, consciousness is not in the body's in consciousness. And I was like, eh? It was right down the line of what we were talking about, but nobody had ever phrased it quite like that. And I was like, I like the sound of that. It sounds like one of those koans. It sounds really neat. But then I started using that in my practice and started exploring. And if you explore the body, how do you know you have a body? You know it because you can see it. You look, I can see your body and tell you. So you hear it. So one part of that perception of me having a body is informed by people telling me, oh, okay, so I have a tall body. But then we see it. When I look down, I can't see my back. So usually my back is not part of the image I have of my body, unless I've seen a photo of it or turn around in the mirror, can do some contortions and you can have a glimpse of it. But generally, the image we have of the body is visual, is through sounds. The stomachs gurgle, we breathe, the breathing makes sounds. Any kind of rubbing, clapping, walking, stomping, like so through seeing, we develop a certain part of the image we have of the body. Through hearing, through smelling. When you shower with coconut flavored shower gel, it's like, oh, my body smells nice. And then you don't shower for 5 days and you think differently. But smell informs you of this body, it informs the perception of the body. Taste does to a certain extent. I mean, you go running and you lick your skin, it's salty from the perspiration that's come out. And feeling, sense of touch. And from these 5 senses, we create an image in the mind, and then we remember the image from yesterday or from years ago, and we may have an image of what the body might be in the future, what it could be according to science, according to genealogy, because of my parents, whatever, or the way I wouldn't like to end up. Like this or like that. So we create images of the body, but they're all created based on these 5 senses. And where do these 5 senses manifest? In consciousness. Where do these images of the body manifest? In consciousness. So when I say the body, what is it? It's an image. It's a perception according to the senses here and now, and an image that we've put together from previous sense contacts, and it's an image, it's created according to these sense doors. So when Paul says that the body is in consciousness, not consciousness in the body, well, okay, so if that's the body, then what's consciousness? How does one fit into the other? For one to fit into the other, one has to be bigger, right? So if consciousness is in the body, what does that say about consciousness? Is my consciousness bigger than yours because I'm taller than you? Or is your consciousness older than mine because you have more white hair than I do? And does it make sense to talk about consciousness like that? To me, it doesn't. But then what is consciousness? And you realize in this reflection, just really investigating and playing with these elements, like if consciousness in the body, what does that imply? And you examine that and you end up with all these dead ends that don't sort of connect, that don't make sense, that don't seem to function and seem to reflect reality. We construct this notion, it's a creation in the mind, that consciousness is in the brain. And we've done it for the reasons we have. But does it actually work that way? If consciousness is in the body, then what happens before this body was born and what happens after death? what happens to consciousness? Then consciousness has to be a thing that attaches to this body, and then when this body collapses, it has to hop over to the next body. So this again is something that maybe makes sense as an image in the mind, but is it actually what's happening? We can believe it, we can convince ourselves of it, but do I actually know that that's what's happening? I can't say that. I can't say I know this is what's happening. Then if I refer back to the Buddha's teachings, the Buddha says, no, there is no entity, no sense of there is no kernel that goes from one body to the next. The way he describes, and that's even if you want to have this conversation about reincarnation before birth and after death, he says it's more like the principle of a candle that's going out. Before the candle goes out, I light another one. I put the wick of the new candle to the old candle, stick it there, the old candle dies. I don't even have to blow it out. When the conditions for that candle to stay burning disappear, it runs out of wick, out of wax, it just goes out. And this candle is burning now. And there is no thing that that candle had that now this candle has. There's a process that was going on here based on causes and conditions that's now happening here with some sort of transition, but there's no thing that went from this candle to that candle. So when the Buddha describes rebirth in terms of reincarnation or whatever the words are, he says it's more akin to that. But you can look at this sense of self, of consciousness, without thinking about past lives and future lives, because it's so speculative. In terms of me, this sense of I am. When I woke up this morning, I felt a certain way. And then now I feel differently. And yet when I woke up, this sense of me in bed waking up, it just wants to turn around and sleep some more. Or maybe it's happy to wake up and get up, but then later in the day, conditions change, and the way I feel is different. So the sense of I, like I was saying earlier, the sense of me is based on the conditions present now that are not present this morning. But they've changed. Some are still, others are not. So looking at consciousness being in the body or the body being in consciousness, every time I explore consciousness being in the body, I just end up with all these dead ends that don't really compute. But anytime I explore the body being in consciousness, it makes sense, and it leaves me with this big openness of I don't actually know, I can't put words on it. So we can explore what we call the body, our perceptions of the body. We can explore consciousness. And as we learn to explore that, consciousness becomes more and more something that you can know here and now through conscious experience. You know, because of conscious experience is happening, you know there is consciousness and experience. We're going to investigate the conscious part, of which the Buddha and the realized beings say it is free from it isn't the body. Bodies arise and cease in consciousness. And at the end, when an enlightened being who's realized the fruits of the practice and has nothing left to do, has let go of everything, this body is still going because it's the result of past karma, but it reaches the end of its tether, it dies, and the description is the 5 candles dissolved, and there's nothing else that serves as a base for attachment. But then they don't go into describing what happens to consciousness, because you can't describe something that's beyond conditions. It's not nothing, but it's not a thing either. And that's why we come back to, I don't know if you're familiar with the morning and evening chanting that we do in the monasteries, but there's this chanting we do where we chant the qualities of the Buddha, the qualities of the Dhamma, the qualities of the Sangha. And the last quality of the Buddha is, of the Dhamma is, it is to be known individually by the wise. So we can find guidance in the teachings, in verbal teachings, in written teachings. but it's pointing back to here, to something that we need to know for ourselves. So your question is a very good question, but bring it back and examine for yourself, like what is the body, what is consciousness, what is the brain, and explore consciousness, explore your experience of the body, because that's what's going to give you the answer. Not the guy sitting here. Apologies. Too late. The microphone is on this side.
Thank you, Ajahn. I've read recently that all over the world, people who experience near-death experiences, they report the same kind of things happening. For example, they rise above their bodies, they look down, see all the people around in the hospital or doctors and whatnot. Their life flashes past, the whole of their life flashes past in front of their eye, in their mind, and they meet a being of light whom they recognize as pure consciousness and something they cannot describe. And many of them say that whatever they think of or imagine immediately appears, and there's no time there. And they also meet relatives who have passed away in the past. How does that sit with Buddhism?
Well, actually, I could come up with some answer based on the Buddhist cosmology, because there is that part of in the Buddhist teachings where he talks about other realms, heavenly realms and hell realms, going up to some very, very refined levels, or hell realms going to incredibly intense realms of suffering. But all the images he gives of them are all based on human perceptions, because that's all we can do. As you were describing these some of these near-death experience perceptions in your question, you said how they see this being of light and they understand that it's pure consciousness. It depends who you ask. Because whatever these experiences are, we interpret it very often according to previous perceptions as well. So some people see a being of light and they come back and say, I met God, or Brahman, or Krishna, or whatever it is. In terms of, I haven't had any near-death experience myself, so I can't speak to that. But it's interesting to see what happens in the mind when we hear about them and read about them, because they're very interesting experiences. And what's interesting about them is how they tend to confirm that the connection from awareness to the body is that, according to these testimonies, there's this experience of witnessing the body from outside the body. So the point of perception from which consciousness is operating is from something outside of this body. So that seems to kind of confirm in a way that, yes, we assume consciousness is in the body, or is the body and is dependent on the body, but apparently it's not. Some people have had experiences that seem to indicate otherwise. In terms of coming back to knowing individually by ourselves, what can we say about these experiences? So, if I want to offer a reply to your actual question, what does the Buddha or the Buddhist teaching say about this? You're best referred to reading up on Buddhist cosmology and seeing how it fits into that. And it is interesting. It's kind of an amusing exploration. But it's more in terms of practice, in terms of understanding for ourselves, it's more a bit of a side trip, going down the side lane before coming back to the actual, what can we know for ourselves? And when I hear stories like that, there's something in me that's fascinated. Sometimes I even notice there's something in me that goes, yeah, I want one of those too. They sound really cool. Especially when these people come back and they say, well, now I don't live my life the same way. Some of the fears and anxieties that I had before have vanished in the light of this experience. I'm like, yeah, I'd like some of that. To be able to kind of shed some of these kind of worries that seem attached to this lifetime. But it's all just wishful thinking as far as investigating experience, conscious experience in this body and mind, and what I can do for myself. Does that make any sense?
May I just add to that, that I, many years ago, when I was a young man, I was involved in a head-on car crash. I wasn't the driver, somebody else was driving. And just before the crash happened, I realized I was going to die, and the whole of my life just flashed by me in a nanosecond. It was very slow, there was no rush. The whole thing lasted less than a second. But my experience of seeing my whole life was very slow and no rush. And it made me just think about the whole of, consciousness in this life and everything else, and look at the spiritual side of life from that point onwards. So it did help me to wake me up to think there is something more beyond just the body,
They're good, these experiences, whether they're our own or other people's. They help kind of inform this question that we all ask ourselves, and sometimes we've forgotten it as we grow up into adult lives and get our standard answers from family and society and whatnot. But what they do is remind us we don't actually necessarily know for ourselves whether we're completely incarcerated in these bodies, and when the body dies, that's the end of it. The screen that goes black, and that's the end or not. And we need to explore this for ourselves. When I grew up, my mother very often encouraged my sisters and I to have nothing to do with drugs, and saying that whatever experiences, spiritual experiences that people could have with drugs could be also experienced through meditation. And I found that very skillful. Like, I was always grateful to my mother for having kind of put it like that, because it also informs my relationship to near-death experiences that I hear people have, and I find them very interesting. And I have a lot of respect for how it informs people's lives and how they choose to hold that experience afterwards. I even read last year, I was reading a book that a friend gave me by a doctor who tried to collate a lot of these near-death experiences. And his whole point was trying to bring disbelievers a little bit further away from disbelief and to open their minds a little bit. So he tried to present the whole near-death experience kind of world bringing it under a microscope, a scientific microscope, so to speak. So I was reading about all these experiences, and at the end I had to kind of laugh and tell myself, well, I haven't had a near-death experience myself. And I can wish for one, but I don't necessarily wish to get in an accident like you described or anything like that. But I realize I do have this blessing of having come across the forest tradition of Buddhism in Thailand and been able to learn meditation and to trust this is a vehicle that's also valid, basically not even necessarily being a monk, but being a human being with a body and a mind offers us the opportunity to explore this. So what is it that happens? What are the questions that arise out of a near-death experience? Those questions we can ask ourselves here and now as well, and go and sit in the temple or sit in a meditation cushion in our dwellings, in our apartments and rooms or whatever houses, and settle down and open up to that. Does that make sense? They're good. They're good at this. At one point in time, these, like any insights that arise in the practice, insights arise and re-inform our view of this experience, this conscious experience of the body and the mind. But once the insight has arisen, has offered us a different point of view where we see things differently, after that they become a memory. So your experience in the car accident at this point in time is a memory. But they're good insights or experiences like that are very good to come back to remind ourselves that the default point of view from which we're operating out of habits is not the only one. It reminds us there is a different point of view, and how do we develop that mobility between points of views that show us a different picture of what we're looking at. So it helps us explore. So they're very valuable memories and experiences if they help us in this way. There's a question back there.
Hello, Ajahn Asoko. Hello, Ajahn Asoko. I wanted to ask in regards to pure consciousness and also what Paul teaches. Because I think there can be sometimes a lot of layers, like the 5 aggregates and the Eightfold Paths, but with that, and I wanted to ask, because you can't intellectually grasp pure consciousness, but Lumpur does refer to that as what Dhamma is. Understanding pure consciousness, having a correct grasp of that, and because that's the Dhamma, is that the way to Nibbana is understanding pure consciousness, a complete understanding of Dhamma in general.
It depends what you mean by understanding. Because knowing, recognizing pure consciousness is Nibbana. It's a recognition, it's a realization. And there's sometimes a description of how these realizations unfold. That you've obviously probably heard of the 4 stages, extreme entry and once returner, non-returner, and arahant. And they're also described sometimes in terms of how much delusion is understood and seen through. And the realization of stream entry, which is really the first time that one has this realization that there is such a thing, that one knows for oneself. Pure consciousness is one has seen through personality view, whatever the personality is made of, identifying with this body and this mind, is seeing through identification with conditioning, and doubt, seeing beyond doubt. And Lumpur has his whole teaching life has spoken regularly and come back to these 3 fetters again and again. Because instead of chasing Nibbana or trying to chase down pure consciousness, both the Buddha and Lumpur in his own practice followed this template of examining these 3 fetters, which are the 3 things that prevent us from realizing the Dhamma, from recognizing this pure consciousness. We don't recognize it because we're holding on to personality and taking personality for reality and our conditioning. I mean, the usual older translation of that second fetter is attachment to rites and rituals. It's a bit of a incomplete translation. It doesn't really encapsulate us. a lot of Westerners coming from a few centuries of Christianity, kind of where we feel that historically we've been treated like generations of people have been told to believe and just be quiet. And kind of, if you do the right thing, many religions actually have these kind of prescriptions which we tend to hold the wrong way and then believe that if we do certain things, it'll take us to heaven, or to realization, or to enlightenment. So it's the belief that conditions are a vehicle to get beyond conditions. And the third one is doubt, intellectual doubt, which stems from thinking. As long as we're trying to think our way to enlightenment, we won't get there because we're holding the wrong thing, we're holding thinking. So when we want to understand pure consciousness, it's not so much a question of understanding it up here from the teaching perspective, from the intellectual perspective, it's more a question of recognizing it, realizing it. There's a way that one hears sometimes some teachers talk about the experience where it's not very often you hear it, but sometimes you hear this said that experiences are not separate from consciousness, they're made of consciousness. And it's also a very interesting way of looking at it, which is a valid, a very useful reflection, because sometimes it's true that when we look at anger, when we work with conditions, in particular emotions and memories and thoughts, moods and views with the body, when we work with these 5 aggregates, we can actually recognize them as objects of awareness. But then, because we're so addicted to thinking and to understanding from an intellectual point of view, we try to understand consciousness from an intellectual perspective as well. And we can't. Because thinking, the intellectual, rational ability, is a thing in consciousness. And consciousness itself doesn't think. Consciousness is a silent witness. It knows in silence. So that's why doubt, rational intellectual doubt, is this third fetter that we need to see past. We need to be able to relinquish thinking, put it down, realize it's a very useful tool, but we can get stuck with it and then we don't know how to operate outside of thinking. So we need to learn to put thinking down and start witnessing experience and thinking, but from the silent witnessing position. And then what happens is not so much understanding consciousness or pure consciousness as much as recognizing it.
And one at that point, how does one identify that they've correctly not identified it, because you were talking about that, but is that something to do with the third fetter possibly? As in thinking, have I understood it correctly, leads to another cycle?
Yes, it does. That's exactly how that doubt manifests in the spiritual practice. Because you experience certain things, you might even have the insight, but then thinking kicks back in, and you go, what was that? Was that really it? And then we're back into this thinking cycle.
Yeah, because when I was speaking to Longpo, I had this experience of feeling something about pure consciousness, but it wasn't feeling something or thinking something. I'm not sure what to say. But then as I thought about that, I said, who am I to think that I've understood what he's saying? That must be wrong, and then that goes away.
Well, that's correct. You recognize that as a thought.
And I just wanted to also ask about, because, for example, in Advaita Vedanta, they have the idea that Brahman or pure consciousness is one, it's non-dual. Do we have separate consciousnesses?
Consciousness is we relate to consciousness as we each have our separate consciousnesses when we identify with consciousness from the perspective of the senses. Because the bodies are different sankharas, they're separate. Your body is sitting over there and mine is sitting over here. So if we identify in terms of consciousness with sense consciousness, well, then they are different. And that's why the Buddha has gone and thrown those into the five khandhas, because they're impermanent. Those perceptions are impermanent because the senses are impermanent. But then when we come back to consciousness, we're talking about consciousness that is one. It's the same consciousness. In the same way that in the Asian spiritual traditions, even Asian medical traditions, they have the elements. They work with earth element, water element, fire element, and wind element. And when they talk about the earth element or the wind element, they're talking about certain characteristics of bodies. There is only one earth element, one water element, and not different water elements and earth elements. And consciousness is one in this similar way that you can try and grasp consciousness, but every time you try to do that, you end up coming back to thinking. And from a thinking perspective, you create an image, a concept of consciousness. But the actual experience of knowing, all you can say about it is that it's knowing here and now. Any limit that we try to perceive of it is going to come from perceiving and conceptualizing. We can't actually find one. So in Lopal's teaching, he's pointing to this ability we have of knowing that is not intellectual, that goes beyond the thinking when he talks about intuitive awareness. That term intuition is referring to that ability to know that is not based on thinking.
So in a way we have different sense consciousnesses, as in the five aggregates that is perceiving something, that I'm seeing you and I'm hearing you. And then there's something above that, in a way, but is ineffable, so it's not possible to
Can't describe it, can't pin it down, can't point to it. You can't put it in a shopping bag and walk away with it. You can't describe it. You can know it. That's the only thing you can know. You can do about it. Because it's the only characteristic of consciousness is knowing, is awareness itself. There's nothing you can say about it to pin it down. You can't grasp it. When you sit and explore the five aggregates and kind of watch what's impermanent and what you're left with, every time you notice one of the five aggregates that arises and ceases, once it has ceased, you're left with awareness of cessation, awareness of a thought that arises, and then the thought ceases, and in the silence you're aware of the absence of thought, but the awareness is always here and now, but you can't point to it. Awareness does not know itself the way it knows a sankhara, and yet Paul talks about awareness being aware of itself, but not in terms of object, not in terms of something you try to grasp. And every time you try to grasp it, you end up finding yourself creating an image of consciousness that then you can grasp. You create a sankhara and grasp the sankhara. But awareness is not something you can define.
In a way, all of the semantics about shared consciousness or
they're pointers.
Then, okay, so the experiential knowing of pure consciousness is more important. Right?
Yeah, it's what you can know for yourself. Like you said, semantics are just semantics.
I had episodes in my life where I felt unconscious of I don't know even how long. It was very short periods of time. So when I came back, I felt really upset that I had opened my eyes, and I was, although it took me a while to recognize where I was and everything, because I felt so peaceful. So it was the most peaceful state that I've ever been. Was that consciousness when I was unconscious?
Well, if you know, then that knowledge of that state answers your own question.
I don't know.
That also answers the question.
Yeah, exactly. I think that when I think of Nibbana, I go back to that experience, and I think that is how I would like to feel. Oh, well, I wasn't feeling, but now I'm in this body, remembering. I think that it was an experience that opened my eyes to how wonderful freedom from this body and these constant desires and problems and feelings and emotions, not to feel anything like, being cold or hot or limited by any of it is actually something wonderful. So I stopped being scared of that.
Sometimes the Nibbana can be described as what is left after everything has ceased. And it is a relief. It's a freedom from everything that is conditioned. I just noticed a few people are starting to move. I lost track of time. So this session ended at 8 minutes ago. So I don't. Anybody who needs to leave, please feel free to do so. And I could stay another 15 minutes or so, but then I have some commitments to attend to.
Just another follow-up question from what that lady was saying. If everyone in this room attained Nirvana, would they have all one consciousness, or would they have different consciousnesses?
You notice how the question comes from a sense of self. That's why it's so important to kind of really understand this first fetter of personality view, because it's a point of view. It's somewhere we come to a sense of self from which we perceive everything, and then we think of Nibbana from a point of view of self, and we try to understand it from a point of view of self. It's impossible to do that because we're trying to perceive and then define and talk about something from a point of view that cannot do that. It's about relinquishing that sense of self and just abiding with awareness as it is. And the Buddha's teachings give us many different ways of doing that. The Buddha's teachings offer many ways of doing that, in a way of putting down the sense of self, even in terms of thinking. We can practice stepping back from self, just in the way we think habitually, like coming back to emotional entanglements, whether it's I'm angry, I'm right, I'm happy. That's how we describe something from the point of view of me, of a self. And then rephrasing it, taking away the personal pronouns. There is anger, there is peace, there is happiness, there is experience. Noticing the difference in what happens. And if we occupy that point of view of self, and we keep operating from that point of view of self, where we say I, then we say, if I say me, I have to say you. because me means this body, and I'm obviously not that body. And then I have my views and I have my preferences. And very quickly, my desires, my likes and dislikes, my wants, wanting this and not wanting that, are going to be different from yours. And every time we operate from this and we get entangled in it, we end up arguing with the world, arguing with other people, with conditions, not wanting things to be a certain way, wanting them to be another way. Or if they're good, then we don't want them to change. So this position, which we can come and occupy intentionally, just for the sake of exploring what happens if I come back to operating from a sense of me, we just end up in trouble every single time. And then what happens if we change the point of view and we remove all those personal pronouns and we follow more the template of the 4 foundations of mindfulness? There's this body. Well, what is this body like? When it was born, it ages, sometimes it's healthy, sometimes it's sick. And what's the nature of the body? It's to get old and die. And we might not like it, but it's still, we're from this point of view of looking at the body as a body, we're able to recognize its nature more readily than if it's my body. If it's my body, I want it to be a certain way. And you realize that the operation of ignorance is not just not knowing, it's not wanting to know certain things, not wanting to be reminded that bodies get sick. You probably are as aware as I am of how uncomfortable a topic of conversation it is at a social dinner to start speaking of death. Can we please talk about something else? This is ignorance operating. Can we please push this unpleasant reality out of the picture and talk about the weather, about movies, about celebrities? Something interesting, something not depressing. So we have a habit of trying to shove out of the picture things that we don't like. That's what we do when we're operating from a sense of self. Because self doesn't like certain things and it likes others. And it tries to hold on to some and get rid of all the others. When we come back to a point of view that is not based on self, we're saying, I like to use the 4 foundations of mindfulness. They're so complete and beautiful. This is the body. These are what feelings are like. This is the mind and the states that it experiences and goes through. These are the realities of experiencing in terms of Dhammas. And every time I come back to that point of view, I'm able to recognize things for what they are. Basically, impermanent, not always satisfying, and sometimes outright suffering, and not self. And that point of view allows likes and dislikes to arise, allows wanting and not wanting to arise. But it always brings me back to a position of accepting reality as it is. If I experience an unpleasant mood from a point of view of self, either I identify with it and I say, I am whatever, I'm unhappy, angry. But when I come back to, in terms of consciousness, what is it? It's just a mood. And I can still find it unpleasant, but I don't get caught up in trying to get rid of it. I don't get caught up in trying to making it different than what it is. There's a willingness to allow an unpleasant experience to arise, to do what it does, to recognize the unpleasantness of it, to recognize the desire that may arise for it to be otherwise, but we don't buy into that either. It's a position of freedom, from where we can allow things to be what they are, and not get caught up in the workings of desire that always lead to suffering. So the Noble Eightfold Path is sometimes referred to simply as the path of non-suffering. It's a very nice way of looking at it. And we don't need to do anything to get anywhere. We just need to stop creating suffering. Let it cease. One last question.
Yeah, it's not a question, it's more of reflections of earlier words. I wanted to thank you first for very useful. So it was about the smith that was working his way to find out what is in the piece of metal that he was working upon. And I think this is the moment when this person who didn't know what to expect was obliterated from this shiny material that he didn't know what's going to be. And to me, that is very much the answer about everything Nibbana, or whatever words we're putting into this pure moment of consciousness that is something else that we've been looking for, searching for, and yet it is something that is different. Thank you.
Thanks, I'll take this opportunity to thank you all for coming and patiently listening, asking very good questions. I hope the reflections have been useful. And I hope to see you here again, continuing your explorations.